focus. So with Pivvot, one of the ways that we help you narrow that focus and start to understand where you want to optimize your routing location is by being able to apply relative costs associated with each one of our data sets. So we have over 85 different data sets in the platform that will help you start to understand the potential considerations that could come up. I'm still having difficulties, apparently.
I can advance for you, Rob. No problem. Sorry about these difficulties.
That's okay.
Me. Now, there we go. Just let me know, Rob, and I'll advance. No problem.
Okay, thanks. So one of the considerations that you may be thinking of is perhaps a depth to shallow bedrock. This could be a consideration that you may or may not want to route your transmission line through these particular areas. So with Pivvot, you can actually come in and you can start to visualize the locations of your data, and then you can also start to apply those relative costs. If it happens to be more expensive for you to route through areas of potentially shallow bedrock, or maybe it's less expensive because you're getting better capacities on your foundations. This is where you're starting to actually open up the possibilities and see where those possibilities exist to give you that information in real time to make those more informed decisions. Megan, if you could do the next one. So one other consideration might be depth to shallow water. Now, not that this would be the only one that might come up as being like the deal killer, but you might be able to visualize and start to see where there are constraints that you may or may not be able to avoid. So just looking at the screen right here, we see that we have shallow water almost throughout our entire area of interest. We may not be able to avoid shallow water, but we may also be able to avoid it in certain areas and still need to deal with it in other areas. What this is doing is just really opening up that possibility and giving you that information that you need so that hey, I may end up with some difficulties with shallow groundwater. I'm just going to know ahead of time for that. So it's something that you can plan and you can account for as you go into further engineering design. And so one of the okay, we're good. So another data set that you can actually look at in Pivvot is a proprietary data set that is actually inspired by Terracon, and it's called our soil behavior class. So this is something that gives you a data-driven approximation of soil conditions throughout the United States, and just another way that you can actually start to plan and consider for different varying soil conditions. As you can see on the screen here, we have an area within our interest that is highly variable. And we could be getting into areas of sand, we could be getting into areas of clay. We also can get into areas of just open water. So these are all considerations that you can be taken into account as you start to narrow that focus into the area that you want to actually start to route your transmission line. And we'll go next, Megan. Another consideration that comes up quite a bit would be just populated places and actual structures. So now you can actually start to open up the possibilities of where you have densely populated areas that you need to avoid, perhaps certain structures that you're needing to avoid. Oftentimes, cemeteries pop up. We've got a, taxidermy and deer processing area right there in the middle of where we might be routing. I'd say those are probably areas that we don't want to, or that we do want to avoid. So these are just giving you that possibilities to open up so that you know what you're getting yourselves into. Megan? You may also want to start to look at the power line and the infrastructure data sets in the area where you can maybe start to look at co-location possibilities. We're going to give you that data set as well, so that you can actually start to look at perhaps co-locating within existing easements. But in the end, after you've done all of your considerations and you've applied those relative costs to the data sets in Pivvot, you're going to have a preliminary route that you can start to look at and start to optimize, depending on if you want to go back in and reapply those relative costs to those data sets and then rerun the analysis. Megan, go to the next. We're going to give you a suitability map as well. So now you can actually turn on and you can actually see where you have told the program where you prefer the route to go and where you would prefer it to exclude. So you can start to see the lighter areas or areas that we would actually prefer to route through, and we can see that the route is taking those areas as best it can, and it's going to exclude those areas that we've told it to exclude. One more, Megan. And then talking about those relative costs that have been associated with those data sets, we're also going to give you a suitability corridor map. And this is something that will open up a little bit more of a possibility that you may not have thought about, where after you have applied those data sets and those relative costs, we are going to give you the kind of the cooler colors, the greens and the blues, as being like the lower relative costs, where now you can start to visualize and maybe even manually start to adjust where you want your route based on possibilities that you may not have known existed. So what's next? After you've gone in and you've gone through your preliminary route analysis and pivot, how else can we help you optimize that particular consideration? So to go into what is next, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Frawley.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. If you're on this webinar, I believe this is a Pivot webinar, technically. You're hopefully well aware of what Pivot is, what they do. You may be less aware of what I specifically am most interested, that being stage one, or what our other presenter, Mr. Steve Curlin, does, and that's of course our due diligence on the consulting side of Terracon. What I want to, I guess, emphasize is that all three of us are Terracon. We're just different phases of a project. We're representing different aspects of the services that Terracon provides. Pivot, of course, is just an excellent platform that curates both publicly available and private data. Now, that data is kept for the benefit of its users, and that's predominantly all of you, our clients. It's software as a service. It's do it yourself. So, you, sir or madam, can go in and explore the data, explore sites, look for new sites, tell the program what's important to you. Rob talked about a few of those constraints like shallow rock, shallow water. There's lots of other constraints in there. Let the program work for you to try to find the best, in this case, route. That's what we're really going to be talking about here, is transmission routing and some of the tools that Terracon has to make your lives easier. We think Pivot's a great place to start. If you're looking for a way to connect point A to point B, Pivot's a great place to go, because it's on your time. You can control all the variables. You can come up with your own solution. But we also recognize that while data, and certainly data at the front end, is critically important to making an informed decision, it doesn't stop there. There's still questions that need answers. And what I'm going to be talking about next is something that Terracon has developed over years of sweat and equity, and that's stage one. And if you want to think of stage one as really kind of the connective tissue between do-it-yourself data and traditional consulting services that Terracon's so good at, stage one fills that niche. Go ahead and advance the slide, Rob or Megan, I'm not sure who has control. And we'll look at, really, it's probably just going to be a map of that alignment that Rob had up previously. What stage one is, see, let me give you guys a little background about what stage one is. So stage one grew out of the idea that Terracon as an organization, as a consulting organization, has been doing what we do for a long time. We've been doing geotechnical exploration, environmental consulting. We've been drilling borings and doing lots of laboratory testing for more than 50 years. We're very good at it. And all of the data that we've been accumulating represented our institutional knowledge. And we could put that institutional knowledge to use, to work for the benefit of our clients. The problem we faced was that a lot of that data was in file cabinets. It was in hard copy reports that were saved in back rooms somewhere. Yeah, we had it technically, but it was incredibly laborious to go into the back room, find the correct box, open it up, find the old report, and then talk to the client about what they might expect on a site. So about 5 years ago, we undertook an intense digitization effort. We opened up all the boxes nationwide. We went to scanning. We've been scanning for 5 years. We're actually still scanning. But we finally now have this data available to us digitally at our fingertips. And that allows us to go into what I would describe as kind of a deeper dive. It's more than just superficial data. It's superficial data plus what we know to be true from drilling all those borings and from writing all those reports. Go ahead and advance to slide one. You'll see what I mean. So what's going to pop up here in just a second is going to be a whole lot of red dots. Now, this is just an example. This is the same profile that Rob showed us earlier from Pivot. This is just a route connecting point A to point B. And we arrived at this by utilizing Pivot and saying, we want to avoid this, we want to go near this. It runs the math and it says, here is generally speaking your preferred route. Well, good. What else can we say? Well, Terracon's done a lot of work in the vicinity of that route. Each of these red dots represents a historic project. Specifically, it represents a historic geotechnical project, which means that we've drilled in the vicinity of all of those small red dots. Now, what's important about these is that those red dots may be something from earlier this year. They may have been a more recent project. They could have been an older project. They could have been 30 years old, from 30 years ago. Regardless, we still have the information. And if you're thinking about subsurface soil conditions, that information is largely evergreen. There's nothing wrong with boring logs from 30 years ago. You can still look at them and get a better understanding about the subsurface conditions along this route. So that's what we're going to be doing with stage one. We have a route. We've established the route in Pivot. Now we're going to take a deeper dive. It's a desktop study, but it's a deeper dive along that route, trying to identify important strength considerations, other things to avoid, really sharpening the pencil when we start thinking about some preliminary estimates or even preliminary design. So what we do is take all the information, and this is in fact what we have done. Take all the information from all of our borings all across the country and compile it. And then we're trying to make sense of it to say, what else can we say on a more regional basis? If you want to advance one slide, it's going to get real colorful real fast. But here's what we're trying to say. Rob talked about one of the unique layers that's available in Pivot, and that's the SBC, the Soil Behavior Classification System. This is really just that same layer, just a little bit more opaque. What you're seeing here is a representation of different soil conditions that we believe to be true. In other words, our data suggests that everywhere you see a certain shade of yellow, that means something to me as a geotechnical engineer. My background's predominantly in geotech. I've been doing this about 20 years. I was a senior geotech PM before switching over to lead the stage one group. So generally speaking, I don't expect you to know this, but if it's yellow, that's typically sandy material. And what this is representing is conditions in the upper 10. We could change that depth if we wanted to. And 10, I mean 10 feet. So in the upper 10 feet, we'd expect sandy material everywhere that it's yellow. Similarly, we'd expect clayey material everywhere that it's green or greenish. You'll see some red and some blue. Those are representing shallow rock and water. So obviously, we're able to start to get a picture of what the subsurface conditions are going to look like. And it's informed by all of the data that we have from all those little red dots. All right, let's go ahead one more slide. And we're going to go from kind of a macro to a micro view. We're now looking at just a small segment of that transmission line route, that possible transmission line route going from point A to point V. What makes transmission lines somewhat unique is that there are towers located along the route. And designers are very, very worried about what is specifically underneath those tower locations. And not so much everywhere else. And that's what makes this kind of a unique exercise for us. Now, I threw these little blue inverted triangles on there to represent a tower. This isn't a real project, it's just an example. I threw these on there at about 1/4 mile spacing. It just depends on the size of the tower, the size of the transmission line. It could be wider or even shallower or narrower. But just for example, these are representing points, and I would argue critical points along that alignment that we are most interested in. What's happening specifically underneath that proposed tower location? What's happening in between it? We really don't care. We do, but not really. I mean, we're interested to know, but we're really most concerned about what is specifically there underneath those locations. Go ahead and go one more slide. We'll show you what I mean and what we're able to kind of do. So when we're producing a stage one for a transmission line, specifically for a transmission like this, we're working with a client, maybe they've used Pivot to identify their route or routes, maybe they've got 2 or 3 alternatives. We hopefully get to this stage where we say, okay, we've got an approximation of where we want to go. What's your tower spacing going to be? We work with the client kind of in a back and forth to say, well, here's about where our towers are going to be located. Then we keep diving. We keep doing that deep dive into what is specifically underneath those locations. And go ahead and hit the next slide. You'll see what I mean. This is what we're able to do based on our data, based on publicly available data that we're then able to cross-reference against our own data, in addition to our own expertise, because we've got engineers all across the country that help us with this. Based on our data at that specific location, here is what our data suggests is there. And you'll see that it looks like a boring log. It's an expected lithology. We have not visited this site. We haven't set foot on it. We haven't told anybody we're looking at it. But we're able to come up with at least an approximation or a good guess, and we're able to even gauge our confidence based on the proximity, the quantity, the age, the quality of our data to say, here's how sure we are. Now, that's just one location. One thing that you'll start to notice is that several of my little pins, those little inverted triangles, fall in the same, what I would call color. Meaning I'm looking specifically, there's kind of this light green, and just to the right of that example tower location that I selected, you have two that I want to say are in the same area. Well, that's convenient. We could probably knock out two towers with one profile. And in fact, we're finding that we can do this repeatedly. So if we have a 40-mile long corridor, you might have 160 towers. You probably do not need 160 profiles. You only need 20, 25. We can generate those based on our data. That's what we're doing. So this is just for an example. This is what specifically is underneath that one tower, as well as any others that are in that dark green. Go ahead and go one or two slides forward, probably just, yeah, one more. There we go. Okay, conversely, there was another profile. Now that was over in the yellow, but I just picked a random spot. There you go. There's what we would expect in that at that location. Now you see that some of these go a little bit deeper than others. What we're trying to do here is utilize our own data. Therefore, we use as much data as we have. If we have relatively shallow data, we can predict only relatively shallow. If we have deeper data, of course, we can go much deeper. Now go ahead one slide, and I'll show you how all this kind of gets put together. Along that alignment, we're able to go along and produce these various profiles, these expected lithologies. In this case, there's 5. These are real profiles that we produce for a T-line. And you'll start to see some kind of interesting things show up. Some extend to 100 feet and there's no rock. Others are encountering rock where you'd expect it, similarly in the 70 to 75 feet range. Critically important information to have up front if you're trying to estimate or preliminary design for a T-line foundation. This is how this can really be applicable to start putting pen to paper. Go ahead and go one slide and I'll show you what else we can do. So that so far is really just an accumulation of our data. We can present it as lithologies. We can talk about it in a general sense. We can even provide it to clients. We oftentimes don't stop there. We've developed what we call the PFP, because we love acronyms, the Predicted Foundation Parameters approach, where we're actually taking each of those profiles, breaking them into their individual layers. I apologize if this is a lot to look at, but the way to read it is one of those stick logs that you saw earlier, that could have been from, for instance, the Tunica soil series. Well, it's much prettier to look at in a boring log on a lithology. But realistically, here it is in a tableized format where you can see the depth of each layer. In addition to the depth, you're going to have an approximation of the density. We're going to have that estimated N value based on our data. And from that, we're working with local engineers who know these soils, who know these conditions, to actually predict the necessary parameters. These are predictions, they're preliminary, they're not for final design. I cannot say that firmly enough, but it's still one heck of a tool because it's going to give a designer LPIL MFAD, really everything that they need to start estimating the cost of their foundations. And this approach is actually leading to a lot more iteration, we're finding. We were able to do this exercise, do the stage 1 desktop study, make these predictions about subsurface conditions, but then also go out and drill the sites as a project moves from planning into permitting, into actually due diligence, then finally into final design and construction. We're able to go out and confirm all of these. We're actually able to augment this table with actual borings. And this table can get somewhat unwieldy and big, but you'll eventually start to see new columns where there's estimated end values, actual end values, predicted parameters, actual parameters. We can actually double check ourselves and see how close we were on the back end. Also, sometimes what we're finding is that these T lines, of course, are going through just very remote stretches of the country. What we've actually started doing is saying, well, we have data for about 90% of your line. We can make very accurate predictions over 90%, but there's this 10% where just we have never drilled. No one has. We're able to stage a preliminary exploration to say, if you're going to do a desktop study, would you be willing to do 2 or 3 borings as well? Because that's going to give us enough data to really inform this to make a really good decision. And it's much cheaper to do 2 or 3 borings than 200 or 300 as more of a planning tool. And this is leading to a lot of these opportunities where we're really rethinking how we're approaching the early stages of these projects. So this is just an example of stage 1, kind of our approach behind it, how it really complements what's available in Pivvot, and what it ultimately connects to on the back end, which is going to be our next speaker, and that's Steve Curlin, talking about what else we do once a project has really gotten legs, has gotten to the point where it's able to proceed. Go back to that one really quick, just for an example. Yeah, have that text box up on the screen really quick. So I just wanted to show you guys this. This is an example, but I did run all the numbers on it just so you guys would kind of see this. So this is it's about 40 mile, so it's about a 38-mile alignment. Within that, we would expect about 152 towers, at least based on a quarter-mile spacing. Of course, that could be more or less. Within that, we had 17 unique soil profiles. That's pretty consumable, meaning you don't have to worry about 152 unique soil profiles. You have to worry about 17. Okay, we can handle that. And then from those 17 profiles, we can even produce that PFB spreadsheet to give you the parameters, or preliminary parameters, I should say, for all 17, allowing you as the preliminary designer or planner to come up with a very realistic cost to build your T-line. So I'm going to stop there, let Steve talk. If you want to go to the next, you'll see the 3 icons there. Steve, take it away. You can tell us all about Terracon.
Thank you. And just to be clear, the context of the discussion I'll have for the last little bit here is more related to the environmental capabilities of how we carry the next phase of investigation. I think it's worth noting, and it might be something that we can revisit at another time, is the layering of Pivvot to stage 1 to the next phase of our geotechnical expertise is a whole different animal and a pretty important part of what we do. As we are able to theorize what the site conditions are, we still need to ground truth that, and by doing so, it's generally through a series of field investigations with the drilling equipment, laboratory testing, pilot testing programs for solar, and other methods and means. So be mindful that I'm going to get into the weeds on environmental, but if you have questions related to how we investigate the next phase of our and your candidate sites, geotech is certainly one of our key expertise. So Megan, if you want to advance, we can go there. Again, Terracon, we're a multi-leg stool of expertise. My side of the house in our power generation and transmission sector relates to our environmental planning and due diligence services. There's a map that shows where all of our offices are. With some exceptions, I think this might be old. There might be more T's in this map now than there were when this was first populated. But more importantly, what we approach for the environmental planning and permitting support services, we do it on a more regional or a hub-based approach. Some markets are stronger than others, or at least more populated by staff. Other markets, as you can see in the West, are a little more sparse as that relates to population and just the basis of our project load. But this is how we approach projects and field services when it comes to requests for environmental planning and permitting services. You can go to the next. Terracon as a company is a well-known name in the market. About 10,000 plus megawatts in solar, which is certainly I think that's an understatement at the moment. We're well beyond that now. Community and utility scale projects. This relates to T-line distribution networks, as well as wind, solar, battery storage, and even some hydro projects now. We support projects as they come out of the concept phase through multi-phased investigational processes. Those are desktop critical issues or constraints analysis, all the way through permit support and permits procurement from local and federal agencies. As we are seeing more and more projects find nexuses that are pulling in federal compliance concerns, Terracon has a very deep bench on the NEPA compliance side that allows us to understand and evaluate projects and navigate the intricacies of both federal and local permitting processes that in most people's minds, and certainly in the past, have been identified as project killers. We are able to help you navigate those projects and get them built under the constraints that are outlined by the guidance. Next. Supporting the same ideas that Rob and Mike had brought to mind. The siting and routing studies are key in implementing a process of evaluating candidates for potential routes and project locations. The idea there is that there is always going to be a path of least resistance, but within that, there's still going to be constraints that have to be managed. So where Pivvot allows you to identify specific constraints that you want to minimize impact to, albeit without some limit of not being able to avoid, we're able to help you construct that path as best as possible and ideally find that path of least resistance. The permitting support, again, we look at and have evaluated thousands of miles of transmission lines and substations and support systems along those lines. So Terracon's background in this marketplace is very deep. We'll go ahead and talk about some of the specific things that we do. Okay. As it relates to early stage evaluation and land acquisition, or even just lease negotiations, Terracon has a national marketplace for folks that will provide phase 1 environmental site assessments as it relate to all appropriate inquiry and circle liability. The investigations can also branch into limited site investigations to investigate specific impacts or known impacts to a property. We have a pretty in-depth knowledge now of how we can help carve out or at least identify and avoid most of these issues. But when it comes to having to evaluate and potentially mitigate, Terracon has a very deep organization of remedial practitioners that can also remediate and hopefully provide regulatory closure that is mutually beneficial to the land and to the operator, providing potential brownfield litigation support, as well as liability protection with long-going cleanup projects. Next. more in depth into the planning services. And when we talk about planning services, these are ideally the items that aren't necessarily related to due diligence or the phase one CERCLA issues. These are the and I know that the people that are out there doing the work hate to hear these things, but this is the bugs and bunnies and the stones and bones side of our business, but have become equally important and I would say of greater importance because they dictate what land is going to be available to you for use, what land will be required to have some permit or mitigation process oversight, and some that may just not be able to be used at all because they're under total or some federal or state low protection. Of particular interest in those are wetlands and waters of the U.S. Terracon has biologists and field technicians that are identifying wetlands and wetland boundaries, consulting with the local Corps of Engineer agencies, mapping lines and helping identify buffers to identify and outline locations that would need to have specific mitigation measures or avoidance measures as it relates to the project design. We can go ahead. Other items that have become particularly interesting are teeny or threatened and endangered species concerns. Terracon, again, based on our model of environmental planning and permitting offices, houses an in-depth bench of biologists with regional and local experience related to species of concern. Of particular interest these days are bats. We have a pretty in-depth bat biologist network that's allowing us to assist in developing monitoring plans and programs, mist netting and acoustical surveys that in some cases will allow us to determine whether the presence absence of a bat species on a site would limit clearing opportunities or even prescribe or dictate during a certain period of the year when clearing can occur, which could have a direct financial and schedule impact on your project. Other, regionally specific projects or species are gopher tortoise, burrowing owls, and a number of others. But we work to stay ahead of federal regulations related to how species are being listed, the implications to how that affects our projects, and mitigation strategies to help provide a path of mutual appeasal or a compromise with the agencies and the outcome of the project. Next. Cultural resources, which we're showing architectural items here, but of most importance to the power industry that I work in and the industry that Terracon supports. The archaeological support or archaeological history is probably the biggest challenge for us, and certainly on the routing side, it's a big deal. Making sure that where we are plotting a site isn't necessarily that we have a known resource, but in a lot of instances now, the SHPOs or the state cultural resource operations are requiring some proving of the negative, meaning if you have an archival map at the local cultural office that states that there aren't resources there, if the conditions or the topographic layout is ripe for what could have supported former inhabitants, we have to prove that through field studies, which are very intensive on cost and time, but we have an incredible network of cultural resource folks that are out there with excellent relationships with the cultural resource offices in the states that have an understanding of their individual operations and SOPs for getting the work completed and submitted and providing that guidance to the client of how to avoid or to prove that the sites have no significance and that there's no impact to their project going forward. Next. I think we probably could say, and we could be on the phone with everyone here for hours talking about our individual items, and certainly in the instance of the environmental, I went through quite a bit of that information without going through each item. I offer, if there are questions related to any of the details that we outlined today, this would be a great time for us to open up to questions. If we run out of time, and I don't know if I'm stepping on Megan's toes here, we'd offer anything by email or even by chat for us to follow up later. But on behalf of Mike and Rob, I certainly appreciate your time and your attention to our presentation here. So I'll turn it back to Megan.
Yeah, thanks so much to Steve, Mike, and Rob today for all that great information. And again, we do have a few minutes left for questions. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat, or if you see the little raise hand feature at the top of your screen, you can click that and we can unmute you. And again, we just want to thank you for joining us today. And like Steve said, this is kind of scratching the surface. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Steve, Mike, or Rob individually. You can find their contact information on our website. All right, well, I don't see any questions coming in, but again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for taking a few minutes, and we hope you have a great day. Take care.